Hands of the week. All right, let's talk about a hand, Rampage versus Garrett. Rampage on the button opens to 1300. So we're playing 51-2-5.
As you do.
So that's what you do.
Maybe first conversation would be pre-flop with two recreational players behind Garrett. Is there any incentives or any reasons to consider having a more robust flatting range?
Yeah, I think you probably want to flat some hands here, but I think you want to flat hands that are going to play well multi-way. But I think we still want to be 3-betting a higher amount than if this was cutoff versus button and we had 2 to 3 recreational players in the blinds, just because we're going to be out of position, absolute position and relative position the whole hand. Garrett goes 5,200 here, and Rampage is going to put in the call, which I think is standard, playing a direct suited connector button versus a blind 3.
Yeah, I don't think you should ever be considering folding 5-4 suited in this situation. In position, very deep, rarely dominated, and against someone like Garrett, who you know isn't just raising top of range, I think this hand plays really well.
Let's talk about what kind of hands Rampage should 4-bet here. Because we always talk about linear ranges, but I think this is a good spot to kind of build a polar 4-bet range. First of all, what is a polar 4-bet range? And why would you be thinking about constructing a polar 4-bet range if you were in Rampage's shoes?
When you are in position, a lot more hands become tempting to flat because you're going to want to play a pot with deep stacks in position. So that middle portion of your range is going to be very tempting to just flat. So a polar range is going to be the very best hands, right? Your aces, your kings, your ace-king suited. And then some hands right at the bottom of what you might consider to be your profitable flatting range. So some weaker suited aces, maybe ace-6 suited, ace-7 suited. Hands like king-9, king-6 suited. Because that polar range allows you to have much easier decisions, right? You know what to do with aces and kings and ace-king suited. And you often know what to do with king-6 suited.
So if they're doing a lot of calling, go linear. If they're doing a lot of extra bet or folding, that's when you go polar.
Yeah. Understanding the mechanics of pre-flop rather than memorizing the ranges is going to be how you build a robust strategy without getting locked into just essentially autopiloting someone else's strategy that doesn't fit well for that situation.
All right.
So
the flop here, 10-8 jack with 2 diamonds, and Garrett is going to start with a check, which is interesting because I'd guess on this board against a competent thinking player that Garrett's probably just going to be playing mostly check.
A lot of the time, a simple strategy played well is going to outperform a complex strategy. I imagine you can do some small betting on this board, but quite frankly, if I'm not absolutely confident, I think simplifying to a lot of checks, and obviously, if I'm thinking about my hands incentives, I think falls very squarely into a hand that wants to do a huge amount of checking.
Let's think about this from Rampage's perspective. We're going to be expecting Garrett to put in quite a few check raises here. So let's talk about the merits of choosing a small size or a big size when we're betting on this board.
Well, if you're going to get check raised, then using a smaller size and then bet folding is less expensive. I think the bit that I'm maybe more interested in is the selection of hands in which I would be betting in the first place, right? Because if we look at a board like Jack 10-8, there are a huge number of bluffs to pick from. When I look down at a hand like 5-4 of hearts, it's not hard to identify I have no showdown value. But if I'm going to be picking bets, I'm going to be using equity to drive a lot of those decisions.
So you're going to have some checks on this board.
I think so. And I think, again, if I'm trying to simplify, a smaller size from Rampage here will allow me to bet more hands. And if I think that Garrett is not necessarily finding all of the check raises, it's not easy to have a balanced check raising strategy on a board like this deep. I think we can often get away with betting more frequently than we should if we don't get raised.
So would you take kind of a small bet or check strategy here if you're Rampage?
I would not be shocked if in theory that the bigger size is the preferred one, where you tend to polarize a little bit more to strong hands and good draws. But I think as a simplified strategy that's going to work well in a live setting, high frequency small betting tends to still be a very effective model.
Rampage goes 6,500 here, and I think Garrett has a pretty easy decision.
Rampage has picked a larger size. I don't know if there's really any conversation about doing anything but just calling.
So he does call, and we go to a turn, and the turn now is a 7 of hearts, bringing in a one-liner straight to a 9, and now giving Rampage a backdoor flush draw. What are you thinking about in Rampage's spot here?
If I was betting 5-4 of hearts on the flop, this is about the biggest green light to continue betting it on the turn. I think what's interesting to think about is the people who have a type 3 betting range, this is an amazing card to put maximum pressure on aces, kings, queens. But Garrett is aggressive with the 3 bets. He is going to have more 9x than your average bear in this situation. So again, as Rampage, I'm still focusing on equity being the driver for most of my bets.
When we're thinking about sizing here, my first thought on this board is we probably want to choose a smaller sizing. And the reason why I would think about choosing a smaller sizing here is because I want to be able to value bet thinly here. I want to be able to bet Jack 10. I want to be able to bet pocket 10s, pocket jacks here on this board, even though it is one-liner. I think betting smaller keeps our options open for the river. Because if we bet small here, in Garrett's mind, Rampage can still have sets in 2 pair if he takes a small size here, which allows us to kind of tell a more coherent story on a board pairing river or on a blank river, where we could still value bet thinly on a blank river, or we can polarize now on a board pairing river. And I think if you take a big size here, I'm not sure Garrett's going to believe the story that you have anything but a straight or air.
Right. And then when the board pairs and you blast off, a lot of people ask, hey, if you have a 1 card straight here and the board's pairing and I can have boats, how much of your range is now actually value and how much of it is all of those draws that potentially miss? It's pretty easy to get imbalance towards missed draws and not enough value.
So Rampage here on this turn is going to go with a bigger bet. So 2/3 pot. Garrett now has an interesting decision, and I think versus the big size, I think it's a little bit easier for Garrett. If Rampage bet 8 here, I think Garrett would have a little bit of a more interesting decision, because if Rampage bets 8,000 here, I think Garrett can start raising off some just naked 9x here, just figuring that Rampage can have a lot of 2-pair sets. But I think in Garrett's mind, when Rampage goes 2/3 here, he's either saying, I have a draw or I have a straight. And so I think raising here becomes a bit more precarious from Garrett's shoes, which is...
Agreed. And I think if I was raising a 9 in the situation against this size, I would want to have essentially a free roll, which is something like ace-9 of hearts, ace-9 of diamonds.
If Rampage bet quarter pot or 1/3 pot here, would you consider raising a naked 9?
Certainly makes the decision more challenging.
I like the term naked 9.
A naked 9. I think a really large size here tends to allow Garrett to play a simple strategy pretty well.
All right, so Garrett calls, and we go to a river, which is a doozy. It is an offsuit 10.
A naked 10.
A naked 10. Garrett checks, and now Rampage has the decision here. Rampage is going to go big here, but not very big. So he's going to go 45 into 56. So pretty big bet. Is this a size that 9x still takes when the board pair? What do you think of Rampage's sizing?
In an odd way, for such a huge dollar figure, it's kind of the middle size, right? It's bigger than I would expect a lot of 9x to bet, and it's not as big as I would expect a hand maybe like Queen 9 or the sets or 2 pairs that are now boats on the river.
And I think this is maybe the problem with Rampage's story here. Maybe in theory he can get away with this size with sets or 2 pair on the turn, but I think if he's trying to tell Garrett the story that I'm still repping sets or 2 pair on the turn, I think if he goes smaller, he has a much more believable story on this river saying, hey, I've got Jack 10, or hey, I've got pocket 8s. And then Rampage can actually polarize on this river and maybe have a half pot size with his 9x type hands and some bluffs in there, maybe some diamond bluffs that he doesn't want to go big with. And then with the big size, the all-in size on this river, he could have the boats, and then he could also have some bluffs as well.
Hands like 8-7 of clubs would be obviously a classic blocker play to polarize on the river, blocking boats and putting Garrett in a really tough spot. So I do think that this middle size against someone who's as good a hand reader as Garrett is going to be a less credible story. Unfortunately, when us humans pick this size on the turn, I think we're mostly thinking 9x or draws. And unfortunately, on a board pairing river, that does not do a lot for our draws. And it makes 9x feel a little less likely and credible to be picking this size on the river.
So 45,000 over to Garrett.
Yeah.
And let's watch what Garrett does.
You're good. He makes the call.
Oops.